Hello, everybody. This is Cody, one of the hosts of Fishin'. What you're about to hear is an older episode that Matt and I recorded very early on for, just practice purposes of learning how to podcast. And so I haven't been feeling well this week, so we're going to just, play back this one. This is an episode about Lantern Control. So if you're still interested, this is pre-banning Banter. This is actually pre-Pro Tour winning Lantern Control. So this is kind of a throwback episode for us, just for me to get back on my feet while I'm under the weather. Please remember to find us on Patreon. It's patreon.com/fishcastmtg. On Twitter as @fishcastmtg. And personally, not Cody Smith on Twitter and Matthew Caudill 8. And please enjoy this throwback episode that we've got planned for you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Fishing, the podcast where I'm learning to suck less at Merfolk and you're learning from my mistakes. My name is Cody. I'm one of the hosts of the show. The other host is my good friend, Matt. How are you doing, Matt?
I am doing fantastic tonight, Cody. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty darn good. So we've got a little show put together here, and we've actually got a special guest to help us out with this show because we're talking about one of the brightest decks in Modern, and that is Lantern Control. So,
wait a second. I thought you said Lantern's the dullest deck in Modern.
Well, no, it's the brightest because of the lanterns. That's
No, it's the dullest because it's watching paint dry.
I think one of the highlights of Lantern Control's coverage was on GP Oklahoma City, where they had a pre-recorded matchup of Lantern Control versus Lantern Control, and they had it slowed down to like 1/10 time, and Rich Hagan was commenting on the footage as if it were one of the most exciting games of Magic. It was probably the best coverage I have ever heard on the Pro Tour or GP circuit there. But before we go very much further, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest. He's
so just like the Lantern Control deck, you're going to make this really long, excruciating.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it won't be too long and excruciating. Our guest is actually a guy from our play group that Matt and I met through Commander, but he is actually an avid player of this fine Magic deck. His name is Nick Comeau. I slaughtered that, didn't I?
Yeah, it's just like comb, like a comb you used to comb your hair, and then O afterward,
Comeau.
like you're speaking Comeau.
¿Cómo estás?
Yeah,
just like
Comeau. Yep.
All right, cool.
So it's like the Beach Boys song Kokomo, right?
Yeah, exactly like that.
I got that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nick, give us a little bit of history about your time playing Modern or just Magic in general.
Yeah. So I started around the time when Zendikar had just cycled out. So I came in
Originals then, correct?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it was, a time when the Grave Titans and Inferno Titans were running rampant, and you had that fun mono blue Delver deck with the Runechanter's Pike. And it was a good time. My first deck was a mono black control deck, and it was just awful. Then I moved on to when Avacyn Restored came out to a fling deck that was also awful. And when I started really playing competitively, it was a standard red deck wins deck with Hellrider, and that deck was awesome. I love that deck.
I would like to point out that you said that your first deck was awful, but I think everyone's first deck is awful, unless they're in everyone's first deck that they make themselves. Especially, that was a time in Magic where you couldn't look at MTG Top 8 or MTG Goldfish and find out what were the top decks.
I'll actually disagree with you a little bit on that, and I don't want to go too far off in the woods. But even if you're net decking, your first deck is going to be awful because you need to learn to play it.
Fair. No, that's a fair point. Just it's one of those things that if you have a good enough deck, you can kind of luck out some wins.
Right.
But
But
if you have a deck that you built yourself out of the boosters that you opened, or maybe like you just like were I'm just gonna open up a box and I'm just gonna build a deck out of what I get. And this was pre-internet, pre net decking. The deck that you build is gonna be just not. You earn you earn points just on having a solid list.
right. That is correct, though. I mean, a bad deck in the hands of a pro will usually win out against a good deck in the hands of someone who's bad at Magic.
So it's learning and just having bad cards.
Yeah.
Hey, real quick, Nick, the reason we have you here tonight is that you actually predominantly play one deck in Modern. We've kind of been hinting at it a little bit, but can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so Lantern Control is actually a deck that really got its big start at the Oklahoma City GP 2 years ago in 2015, piloted by Zach Elsick, who took it all the way to the Grand Prix Championship. And I was watching that GP because I was just getting into Modern. I was playing a burn deck and I hated it. It was just really boring. So I was playing this burn deck and I wanted to try to find something new. So I started watching coverage and I see Zach Elsick win in the finals against Brian Braun-Duin, who had just come off a Legacy GP win and a Standard GP win. And I just fell in love with the deck. So I sold all of my burn stuff in order to buy the Lantern Control stuff. And the first time I got to play it was at a PPTQ where I made top 8. It was one of the best Magic experiences I've had, actually.
It's definitely fun when you can pilot a deck that you like to a solid win like that. I mean, top 8ing at PPTQ is pretty killer, especially if you haven't had a whole lot of experience with the deck.
Yeah, I before that I'd spent the last 2 weeks. I had a lot more time at that point, so I spent the last 2 weeks reading every single article I could find about Lantern Control. I was practicing with it with proxy cards and learning how to play it like that, watching all the videos I could find, and I managed to make it to top 8 and beating out Burn in the top 8, which at that time was the worst matchup, was very satisfying.
I bet. So before we get too much further into our discussion of Lantern Control, we're going to do our favorite segment on this deck, and it's the random Merfolk card. So the random Merfolk card we pulled up, I had Nick guess a random number on our list of, I think it's 190 something. I'll have to look that up again, but it's in that number. Nick, our esteemed guest, picked 187, which is C. Scryer. 1 in a blue for a Merfolk. He's a 1/1 from Mirage, and you tap to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool. Play this ability as a mana source. And it also has 1 in the tap. Add blue to your mana pool. Play this ability as a mana source. So how could we use this in Eternal formats?
Well, before we go too far on this one, I do want to point out that being Mirage, it was a kind of an odd time of Magic. There was no such thing as a good card. Everything was well balanced back in that kind of day, or it was insanely broken. And in all fairness, this is a really just well balanced card. Something you really won't see play at all nowadays. And again, I was a sidewalk player at the time that Mirage was going on, so competitively, I don't know if this ever saw play. I highly doubt it. But it's a fair card. I mean, it's kind of a crappy mana rock. So, I mean, you have to take. So it's not going to be legal in Standard, obviously. It's Mirage, so it's not legal in Modern. So we can't even talk about those formats. So we're pulling Legacy, Vintage, Pauper, and Commander at this point. Legacy, Vintage, throw it out the window. There's just absolutely no way. Pauper, probably not. I just can't see any deck where this would be even viable. Commander, maybe.
So before
Pauper Commander, yes.
Definitely Pauper Commander. If you're looking for your super hot Merfolk Pauper Commander list, this definitely makes the cut because you don't have enough picks as it is.
This is a Pauper Commander All-Star.
Yeah.
And when it comes to fixing, weren't the shitty fetches in the Mirage block?
Yeah, the slow fetches like Rocky Tar Pit.
Yeah.
Floodplain, not Rocky Tar Pit, Floodplain, Mountain Valley. They were all they were super badly named, but they come into play tapped, and then when it untaps, you can tap and sacrifice it to search for a, like in the case of Floodplain, an island or a plains, and it comes into play untapped, which are actually pretty good in Commander. But here we are talking about formats that probably wouldn't have. I mean, in draft, you wouldn't have had a lot of those running around. Mm-hmm. And I mean, maybe you have those, in Commander and all that, but still, it doesn't really even interact with those well.
No. I mean, I see this, I'm like, I just want to put a skull clamp on it and move on with my life.
Fair. You use it as fixing early, and then when you pull out your skull clamp or your Phyrexian altar, you just go, nope, you're gone. You've served your purpose, and your parts now serve Phyrexia.
More or less. I mean, in all fairness, I mean, it's an old set. None of us did draft in Mirage. I'm assuming most listeners haven't done draft in Mirage. I think you can probably get a Mirage starter deck for what, $30 or $50. I mean, that might be a fun thing to do, and I mean, not necessarily trying to go out and pull a Sea Scryer. I mean, obviously, we all want LEDs, but I mean, who knows? Maybe in like Mirage Sealed, it would be a fun card to play. I mean, it's something that makes me kind of want to try it out now.
Yeah, no, it would be interesting. So we're gonna go into Lantern. So Nick, you are our premier expert in Lantern control. So we're gonna give you the floor for a little bit to discuss main win cons of the deck. Maybe briefly go over the deck list. We want to kind of learn what makes Lantern control tick.
Okay, audience, just bear in mind he's a Lantern player. This is gonna be really long. You're not.
Yeah. I'm sorry. It's just the Lantern deck is insanely fun to play on my side of it. I know it's kind of a nightmare for anyone else going up against it. But essentially, it's called a Lantern control deck, but in reality, it's a prison deck. The slight difference being a control deck is more into reacting to your cards and trying to control your natural draws and what you can naturally do. A prison deck is more along the lines of an Ensnaring Bridge Blood Moon deck, where they just take away all of your options. You can't do anything. You don't have the ability to do anything. So the way Lantern wins is they land a card called Ensnaring Bridge, which was printed in 8th edition. So it's reprinted in 8th edition. So it's just legal in Modern.
Original printing is wrong.
8th edition is kind of like a lot of cards just sneaking into Modern. A lot of things like Blood Moon, Ensnaring Bridge that just otherwise would not be in Modern.
The Tron lands.
Oh yeah. No, there's so much in 8th edition. I think we could do just a podcast dedicated to cards that snuck in via 8th edition. But I know
there's been a lot of people who said if Modern just banned 8th edition, it would fix the format completely.
I don't subscribe to that point of view personally, but I have heard that before. Yeah.
There's definitely something to be said about it, but we'll allow Nick to continue with his Lantern control list here.
So, Ensnaring Bridge is a 3-mana artifact that reads, creatures with power greater than the number of cards in your hand can't attack. So, it's completely fair 100% because it's a symmetrical effect, you see. Like balance and upheaval, just totally fair Magic card.
It's fair. It's definitely fair in decks that don't play creatures. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely 100%. Yeah. Again, that's true with any symmetrical effect. Blood Moon, same way. Completely fair Magic card.
Definitely.
So after they land in the Ensnaring Bridge and prevent your creatures from ever killing the Lantern player, they play a draft reject called Lantern of Insight, which I think it's a 5th Dawn card.
5th Dawn, that's correct.
That is correct, yeah.
Yeah, and it's absolutely terrible and reads, both players play with the top card of the library revealed, and you can tap it and sack it to make target player shuffle his or her library. And then you combine this with mill artifacts like Codex Shredder and Ghoul Caller's Bell and Pixis of Pandemonium, and you just control their draw step for the rest of the game, so they never draw anything relevant to get them out of the situation. You can give them as many creatures as you want. At some point, you can give them as many burn spells as they want. Once you land a bridge, their counter spells don't really matter because you locked them out of the game, and you don't really need to play any more spells to win. You already have the inevitability, so you don't need to do much else.
Let me stop you real quick. So what you said is even when you have once you have landed the bridge, their counterspells don't mean anything.
Once you've landed the bridge and in the Lantern of Insight plus 1 or 2 mill effects. Yeah.
Okay. So and the reason that is because you don't need anything else to win. You've already got your quote unquote combo in place. You're already seeing what they're drawing, and you're letting them draw all the creatures they want, and you're rejecting any artifact destruction, any upheaval effects, like you said, echoing truth, those sorts of things that could disrupt you because you are disrupting them too heavily.
Right. And two cards that I'm sure Nick's going to get to, but I'm going to step on his toes a little bit here, that really push this deck over the top are Pithing Needle. I know the deck runs between 2 and 4. Nick, I'm not sure how many you personally run. Which Pithing Needle, when it's 1 mana for an artifact. It came from the Kamigawa block initially. Mm-hmm. But then you can name any card in Magic's history, and as long as it's not a mana ability, the activated abilities of that card can't be played. Shuts down planeswalkers. It shuts down. It shuts down almost everything. It's incredibly frustrating to play against, especially somebody who knows how to play it. And then Academy Runs, a land out of the Time Spiral block that taps for a blue, I believe. But what really puts it over the top is it's 1 and something. I can't remember the exact the activation cost. But then you tap it, and you can put target artifact from your graveyard on top of your library. So that's kind of what Nick was getting at, where counterspells really don't matter as much because he can just Academy Runs them back anyway.
Yeah. Academy Runes, it's actually tapped for a colorless, which can be relevant in this new build that's been around for a couple months.
Okay, thank you.
And then it taps and then you're able to tap it and pay a blue into colorless to put target artifact on top of your library.
Thank you for correcting me.
Yeah.
So if your Ensnaring Bridge is lost, you can just go, that's fine, I'll bring it back. And one other thing that's really good, from the list that I'm looking at it looks like it, I mean, Academy Runes is a legendary land, so you're only running 1, so you're definitely running a card that searches for a colorless card, am I right?
Ancient Stirrings, yeah.
Ancient Stirrings.
Yeah, Ancient Stirrings, the best cantrip in Modern.
For now, I have an inkling that this card will be banned here in the near future, but for now it's legal.
Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I guess it's kind of a toss-up. It is incredibly powerful, especially in the Tron deck and in the Lantern deck. But I think the deck building restriction makes it just bad enough. But what do I know?
So the thing about Ancient Stirrings is, and you're running 4 of, or is that correct?
Yeah, Ancient Stirrings is a 4 of, and basically every single Lantern list you will ever see.
Yeah, the list that I pulled up, it runs 4 of, and I mean, you basically find any piece that you're missing, really, with Ancient Stirrings. You can find
digging 5 is just ridiculous. You're more or less always going to hit something you need.
Right. Yeah, the Ancient Stirrings really ties the deck together. There were some versions that tried playing Glint Nest Crane, which is a 2-drop creature that it's a 1/3 flyer. And you look at the top 4 cards of your library and choose an artifact to put into your hand. But it wasn't nearly as good because there were so many times where I would play it and you would just miss because you can't pick up lands.
Yep.
And now, one other thing that you did play against me to good effect, and I missed and actually probably lost game 2 to, was Word of Invention.
Yeah.
Because you have all these artifacts that don't do anything besides, they're locked pieces. But
right.
Which, by the way, for anybody who's listening, if you don't have your playset of Word of Inventions, buy them now. This card is going to spike so hard.
Oh, I'm sure. But
hard to say.
basically what you're saying is you can use the lock pieces that you have in play to tutor up the lock piece that you don't have.
Yeah, yeah, to a certain extent.
All right.
And Word Invention, it's really such a great addition. This deck was really waning in just a pure green black version. It wasn't putting up many results. I was playing it online, and it just wasn't doing well. I mean, I was lucky to go 3-2 in just the straight green black version, but the Word Invention, which is usually a 3 or 4 of in the Lantern decks now, it just makes it such a good utility build. You can play a one of Grafdigger's Cage to help against any Collected Company decks or any Storm decks or Dredge or anything like that. It essentially gives you an additional 4 copies of Ensnaring Bridge, which beats around 60 of the decks game 1 just straight up. It lets you go get a Witchbane Orb, which most lists are running at least one of now, to help against any burn matchup. It also stops the Scapeshift combo. It can stop a lot of things. And it's such a great utility card.
And Witchbane Orb costs 4 and enters the battlefield. You destroy all curses, but that's definitely not why you're running it. You're running it so you have hexproof.
Yeah, you're running it for the hexproof.
I love that destroy all curses attached to you.
For those who are unfamiliar, Word of Invention, it's basically Court of Calling in blue for artifacts. It's triple blue, X. Then it has Improvise, which means you can tap any amount of artifacts to help pay for the X cost.
Yeah, so I mean, you've basically explained it. You control the top of your opponent's deck, and you allow them to draw things that are irrelevant to you winning, and you get rid of things that could, in effect, get your opponent out of the lock.
Right.
So and once you have this in place, it's just a very long game because they could continue playing, and
Right.
they could feasibly get out of it at some point.
Right.
However, it's not likely.
Yeah, people run the percentages, and it's usually like below 1% that they ever get out of the lock, but that's enough to keep playing. So,
especially if you're at a GP or a Pro Tour, you're gonna eke out those percentages because 1% is definitely something worth pursuing.
Yeah, definitely.
And in all fairness, the clock can be the Lanterns more of an enemy for the Lantern player than the actual opponent they're playing against.
Sometimes. In the hands of most competent Lantern players, the clock never really becomes an issue. Okay. But really, I at least have lost a couple rounds when I was first playing with the deck due to my opponent's slow play that I wasn't willing to call.
Okay.
So you really kind of have to stay on top of it.
So as long as you practice with the deck and I assume that this also comes from playing online on Moto, when you're on your own time,
mm-hmm.
you really learn to put effort into what matters and just kind of go, oh, that's a creature, yeah, sure, just F2 through it, right? Yeah. So now we're going to talk about Lantern control in regards to Merfolk. So this also doesn't just apply to Merfolk. This basically applies to any creature-based deck. So things like fairies, things like Bogles. I think it's Boggles, Death Shadow.
You say tomato, I say Bogles. I mean,
and I'm sure actually. I feel like Eldrazi isn't even too big of a deal for you as long as they don't get under you, right?
Yeah. The few decks that are a problem are Green Black Tron, just because they have so many relevant cards. It's so hard to keep that deck under control. Burn can sometimes be an issue depending on if they have a quick draw. Jund can be a problem just because they have so many removal spells for your Ensnaring Bridge, as well as just a lot of ways to draw them. And a lot of the other decks are a toss-up. Valakut can kill you quickly if you don't get that Witchbane Arm out. Storm can be a problem if you can't get a War of Invention for Grafdigger's Cage. It's just a lot of your decks game 1 are favored for you, but you can win almost any matchup potentially.
And that seems like a really good deck to bring to a GP. I mean, we do have one coming up, the team GP, and
I know BBD has said recently that Lantern is probably the best deck in Modern right now, at least in his opinion. I don't necessarily disagree either. It's a very powerful deck in this meta currently.
It is. I agree with BBD. I think it is the best deck in Modern right now, but it is insanely hard to play correctly. I've been playing for 2 years, and I make mistakes all the time. It's very hard to play correctly, and the smallest decisions will kill you.
Sure, and I know I've been giving the deck a lot of crap, but I actually really do and like the deck myself. But it's also hard to play live, especially when you want to have fun with people, because you're right, it's not a fun deck to be on the opposite side of the table.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's like, since I'm the Tron guy, I get the same hate. People just groan and just complain playing against you, but when they get the upper hand, they start gloating really hard to your face.
Right, right. Yeah, I've gotten a lot of salt playing Lantern. There were 3 matches in just this past month I was playing on Moto where I had my opponent like a lethal mill effect on the stack, and they waited for themselves to time out. So I had to wait around for additional 10 minutes against 3 separate opponents. The deck gets a lot of hate.
Sure.
And especially when you're playing, and actually, so the deck that I played before me buying into Merfolk, and I'm still buying the parts, but the deck that I was playing before this was Cheerios, which kind of acts semi-similarly to Lantern Control, just in that when you play against it, it's like, do I win? Did I lose? And your opponent really, I mean, they do affect the game, but nobody wants to play pickup games against the guy they know is a Lantern Control player.
Right.
Nobody wants to play pickup games against the guy they know is basically a storm deck. They're just like, all right, I might as well just flip a coin.
Yeah, well, at least in Storm and Cheerios, the games are over in like 5 minutes.
Yeah, that makes
Lantern. You're going to run the entire 45.
That makes it so much worse because you have to just sit there and you just have to go. You're just shuffling the few cards in your hand, because I mean you're also running. From what I see, I also at least saw Inquisition of Kozilek, and I assume you're running some number of Thoughtseize.
Yeah, I personally play 4 Inquisition and 3 Thoughtseize.
Okay,
mm-hmm.
That's
pretty stuff.
Yeah, the list that I'm looking at is running 4 Inquisition, 3 Thoughtseize, but it's so crazy that there's just so many one or two of artifacts in here. So I mean, we obviously talked about Codex Shredder. We talked about Ensnaring Bridge. In the list I'm looking at, there's a Grafdigger's Cage.
Yep.
So that's really good against, I mean, on top of just the other reasons why this deck is good against Merfolk, but I mean, this just nulls our 4 Aether Vials.
So, I'm not the Merfolk player, but I've done a little research into it, and I've seen some of the worst matchups for Merfolk. It seems that Elves is an awful matchup, Affinity is an awful matchup, and then Lantern is an awful matchup.
Well, Lantern is really bad just because they're like, oh, you're playing Merfolk, and then they go, I'm just going to tutor up my Ensnaring Bridge, and it doesn't matter what you do, because as soon as any Merfolk player can, they're going to put down as many lords as possible, and even when they don't try to actively put as many lords in as possible, the deck runs 12 lords. So sometimes they sneak into play. They're little, they're slippery dudes. They just kind of fall onto the battlefield. So,
and for the sake of conversation, we're going to assume that the person playing Lantern is an experienced Lantern player that knows the deck, or at least. So, and Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously I'm not an experienced Lantern player. I've played against it multiple times, but I've actually personally never piloted it. Against Merfolk, Merfolk's an auto loss or auto loses to Lantern game 1, correct?
Basically, yeah.
I mean, there's nothing. I mean, Ensnaring Bridge hits, and there's nothing they can do.
The entirety of game 1 is whether or not the Lantern player can find the bridge before the Merfolk player kills them. But this is finding a bridge between 3 Ensnaring Bridge, 4 War of Invention, and 4 Ancient Stirrings, plus Lantern and mill effects.
So I really like we have shared notes that we put in, and Nick actually has. I like to give this distinction to Nick as having the most extensive notes out of the 2 shows that we've had. He added like a page and a half of notes to this.
This is I'm the bad student and Nick's the good student. Whereas for the notes, about an hour and a half before we air, I just read through them. I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. I can talk about that. I pull them up today, and I'm looking. I'm like, holy crap! Nick wrote a novel.
but Nick had a last sentence which rings all too eerily, because I've done some brief testing with Merfolk over the last couple of weeks, and I've watched games of Magic, of Nikachu, Merfolk Joe. I've consumed as much Merfolk content as I can, basically, and the
you're gonna have mercury poisoning all the Merfolk you've consumed.
Basically, that's really the levels are dangerous. I might die any second. The sentence that Nick wrote at the end was, a lot has to go right for the Merfolk player and a lot has to go wrong for the Lantern player, and that is just so correct. I mean, when I played against you game 1, I had no hope.
Yeah.
You Inquisitioned, and then you Inquisitioned, and then you Ensnaring Bridged, and then, or you even just Codex Shredder, like that it's like, oh, that's a Lord? No.
Yeah.
In Codex Shredder, all the mill effects, they get rid of creatures early, and then once you have Ensnaring Bridge, sure, have your Lords.
Yeah.
No problem.
So if you're at a GP or a big time tournament, play it out. You might as well make the Lantern player actually do what they have to do. But if you're at FNM or a more casual environment, I mean, if you're playing Merfolk and you see Lantern game 1, if they drop that bridge, I would just scoop and move on to game 2 in the sideboards.
I kind of disagree. If it's like noon and they drop a bridge against you and you're a Merfolk player, just concede, then go to the next game, and then maybe you can grab lunch in between a round.
There you go. Love it.
That's good.
Oh, he's throwing salt in the wound of the salty player.
He's like, hey man, it's no big deal. You might as well just, hey look, there's a fresh sandwich cart over there. You might as well just stop by there.
Oh, you got some salt? I got some salt too.
He's like, hey man, I heard the sandwiches over at Sbarro are really good. You should really stop by there. So game one is almost an auto loss. We're assuming.
I think we can move on. There's just, I mean, they're gonna Pithy Needle your Aether Vials, and they're gonna drop Bridge. You have no interaction at that point. You can play lands.
Yeah, that's fun. I like playing lands.
Well, and to Nick's point, or to Matt, you just said, with the Pithing Needle, Nick played Pithing Needle against me, and he named my Mutavaults, which is huge against Merfolk.
I mean, I'm not the player, but the way I would see it playing out depends on where you're at. But if I'm on the draw as the Lantern player, and again, if I'm completely wrong, Nick, and I'm full of shit, just let me know. But if you drop a Aether Vial turn 1, as the Merfolk player should do, and I have a Pithing Needle, I'm going to play it on the draw turn 1.
No, that's absolutely true. That is absolutely true. In me and Cody's game, I Inquisitioned him twice by that point. I know he didn't have an Aether Vial, but he did have 2 Mutavaults. I took away his first 2 plays, so Pithing Needle and Mutavault was the correct choice at that point.
Sure. There you go. So it's a situational thing.
It's a situation.
And obviously, like, if somebody goes island, several islands or island Mutavault, then you kind of know that they're playing fish. So Aether Vial is a very safe pick.
Right. I mean, realistically, if you play a basic island your first turn without fetching for it, you're more often than not going to be playing fish.
Right. The other corner case is if I have a Word Invention in hand to get Ensnaring Bridge, and they have a Curse Catcher. Then you Pithing Needle Curse Catcher so you can get your Word of Resolve. And
actually, that was where I lost game 2, was you snuck out a Word of Invention, and I just was like, yeah, sure. And I should have just gone, absolutely not, and just sacked the Curse Catcher first chance I got.
I didn't have enough other attacks in order to pay for
it. So game 1 is over. 35 minutes have passed, and the fish player hates life and is thinking about ending it all and going to buy a Slurpee. So we're going to sideboards.
So
Yeah.
so sideboarding, I pretty much have a pretty straight plan against Lantern Control. So we're definitely taking out. We're adding in the 3 ceremonious rejections.
Yeah.
And we're adding in the 3 negates.
Yep.
And we're adding in the 3 unified wills.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
We're cutting 4 spreading seas. Oh, sorry, yeah, we're cutting the spreading seas because basically
it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter with the ensnaring bridge. I mean, especially game 2, the bridge player knows. If I'm game 2 against Nick, he knows, and it doesn't matter. The first chance he gets, ensnaring bridge is going to land.
Yep.
So spreading seas doesn't do anything. We're definitely cutting dismembers. Dismember does nothing against the Lantern Control deck.
Get it out of there.
It is definitely terrible. And then I also I feel like cutting Kira and Kopala because they
do nothing.
They do nothing. It's very simple. So we're adding, let's see here, 3, 6, 9 cards, and basically we've cut 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I mean maybe, I don't know, cut
Aether Vial.
Cut 1 Aether Vial. Because if we can, we want Aether Vial, but obviously more Pithing Needles are going to come out of the side and just go, no. No Aether Vials. I'm totally fine with actually cutting more of those and even putting in just Relic, because most of the time...
that was going to be my point, actually. And again, and Nick, please hop in on this. I think Relic is probably, after Ceremonious Rejection, your best sideboard card against them. Because 1, Nick is going to be trying to recurse some stuff from the graveyard that you counter. And 2, you need to draw extra cards against the Lantern player.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially your first draw is going to be a dead card. So the extra card that you draw is really the only chance you have.
Actually, before Nick jumps in, I'm going to correct you, Matt, because game 2 you are going to be on the play, so you'll at least get 1 card in.
Fair.
So yeah, I do like Relic in the matchup. I think that Unified Will, in Kody's sideboard at least, is better. And Ceremonious Rejection is actually pretty good too. I think Unified Will is actually better than Ceremonious Rejection because Ceremonious Rejection can't hit Word Invention. So
I mean, if I'm running Kody's list, I'm bringing in all 12 of those cards because realistically, you don't even need that many fish in the matchup. Because I mean, if you get past the ensnaring bridge, there's nothing that you can do. You're dead.
Yeah. Kody's list is interesting because it doesn't play any Echoing Truth and it doesn't play any Hurkyl's Recall. And
I've mentioned this to Kody before. I think not running at least 1 Hurkyl's Recall is very ballsy, especially because Affinity is another really bad matchup for you.
Right. But then again, Hurkyl's Recall, as I understand it, isn't even great against Affinity. They just play out all their stuff again and you're left in the same board state.
It bounces their lands, if I remember correctly. If they turn them into creatures, I might be wrong on that.
It actually doesn't, because they're not artifacts. They're they
turn to artifact creatures when you activate them.
Yeah, they do turn into artifact creatures. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. In like Nick's credit, he plays more modern than I do.
It would. I just looked it up. It would bounce all their lands, including their artifact lands. So like their Darksteel lands, whatever the hell they're called.
Right. But I've at least seen good Affinity players play around that by not animating their lands unless they absolutely have to. They don't go for the fast kill because they know they can outpace the Merfolk player as is. They don't need that extra edge with their lands, so they avoid animating them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, at this point, we're since you're such a dog in the matchup, and I mean, it goes for Affinity and Lantern. I think having that bullet in the chamber is still better than not.
Right, and that's probably true, but I don't know. I'm not a Merfolk player either.
So to wrap things up, I mean, we're pretty much going into game 2 with a loss. So and even with all these great sideboard options, Nick, I think you'd agree that really Lantern still has the edge.
Yeah, so Lantern doesn't have to do much to win this matchup. They basically just need to land a bridge and then protect it from an Echoing Truth or Hurkyl's Recall. They're only going to bring in a couple cards. They're going to bring in 2 Leyline of Sanctities, usually. It will vary depending on the Lantern player, but 2 Line of Sanctities is what I bring in because it protects against Hurkyl's and it empties your hand quickly. They could also bring in a number of Abrupt Decays or Maelstrom Pulses, or Perfory Nodes / Pyroclasms. Everyone's familiar with Pyroclasms. Perfory Nodes is a weird enchantment. It's a 1-mana white enchantment that destroys the creature with the lowest power on the table every one of my upkeeps.
It's a planar chaos reprint of drop.
Yeah, so it's an interesting card. But the main reason Lantern is bringing these cards in is because they have dead cards in the matchup. Grafdigger's Cage does stone nothing because it doesn't protect against Aether Vial because the cards have to come from the library or the graveyard in order for it to be stopped, not the hand. You can show and tell something in. Grafdigger's Cage does not stop that.
So while we've got Nick here on the cast, we're gonna wrap things up with a brief overview of GP Oklahoma City, because that's kind of our biggest event that we've had recently. So I've got it pulled up here. We had in first and second we had Scapeshift, in third we had Black Green Tron, in fourth we had Dredge, fifth was Jeskai Breach. Then we had Living End, and then 2 mono green Tron lists. So 3 Tron lists in the top 8 there. So Matt, I'm sure you're totally okay with that.
Yeah, well, I am. So I follow a lot of the pros on Twitter, and seeing this and the non-interactive decks doing so well at this particular GP is what has really brought to light the conversation of getting something banned out of Tron. And that's kind of what we had the conversation off air about Ancient Stirrings most likely being the culprit. So it's one of those things. I personally think Tron is a fair deck. It is incredibly powerful in this current meta, but there's always ways around to beating it. So
yeah, I think the meta just needs to adjust.
I completely agree.
Well, and that's all good and well, but the thing is that, you know, that generally I think that honestly both of the decks are fine. They're obviously Lantern is not a good matchup for me, but that doesn't mean that I think it shouldn't exist. And
right.
And just I don't know. I don't think that I mean Tron hasn't won a GP, has it? Like
not in a long time.
One. You know, like, or I mean, definitely not won a Pro Tour. We haven't had too many modern Pro Tours. So
yeah, it's just one of those things. I mean, it's always a bridesmaid, never a bride. But I mean, for some reason, people can't stand playing against it. I mean, and I play Grixis Control as well, and when people drop a turn 3 card on me, it's incredibly frustrating because it's an insanely powerful card. But anyway, I mean, getting back to some of the fish talk, did Nikachu play in that tournament or in that GP? Because with that top 8, you would think that Merfolk in that particular meta would have been doing really well.
He did not, and actually, that kind of Nick and I were talking about this prior to us going on air. Was, you know, we have Grand Prix San Jose coming up, and we were discussing, you know, what would be good, you know, based off of what we saw at GP Oklahoma City. You know, we saw lots of Tron, lots of Scapeshift, and then Lantern Control was also a pretty big deal at GP Oklahoma City. So now we're talking about, you know, decks that are very control-y, and in Modern it's a turn 4 format. You know, if before turn 4 generally is where, you know, if you haven't won by turn 4, you're firmly in the lead, right? Like, so with Tron, with Lantern Control,
you're gonna have the board.
Yeah, you're gonna have the board. So if aggro decks need to win before turn 4, control.
No. Again, I mean, and that's kind of a common misconception. The way that Modern is set up is that you're not really going to be winning on turn 4 more often than not, but the game is going to be over by turn 4. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that's more what I meant. And I thank you for clarifying that, because obviously games go much longer than turn 4 often in Modern. But what we're talking about is like Tron. You know, when they have 7 mana, they can play basically anything that comes off the top of their deck. And in the case of Lantern Control, we have a deck that basically just goes, no, you're just gonna not play anything for 20 turns.
Mm-hmm.
So Nick and I were discussing, if we were to play in a GP, and the main information that we were going off of was the list of decks that were played at GP Oklahoma City. So we have a lot of Tron lists, a lot of Scape Shift, and a lot of I know that Lantern Control was there. It was definitely a presence. People were talking about it a lot.
Yeah. The
What
thing about Lantern Control, though, is that it's a very hard deck to play. It's a very hard deck to pick up, go to a GP, and then do well without a ton of practice beforehand. So I don't think it'll ever be insanely prominent. You won't ever have a ton of Lantern players showing up to any given tournament, but it still is a very good deck, especially in the hands of pros like Sam Black and Ryan Von Duen.
A good example of that is we have a friend named TJ, and he showed up with a stock Doomsday list to a Legacy event and had never played Doomsday before, barely knew the deck. And he went 0-4, and he actually lost to the 6-year-old who showed up with like his intro deck at a Legacy event.
And we're actually kind of going full circle where we were talking about, if you don't have experience with the deck, even if it's a good deck, like Lantern Control has obviously shown itself to be a good deck, and it hasn't won a GP. And that doesn't make it a bad deck. But
It has won a GP.
It has won a GP?
GP Oklahoma City 2 years ago.
Oh, right. Yeah, you had said that. I apologize. But so besides that one GP, it has shown up, I'm sure, in top eights all over the place, and I'm sure our own Nick here has taken it to several MTGO events in the top 8. However, when you have a complicated deck like Doomsday or Lantern Control, it can often just string out and just be really hard. It can be really hard to win with the deck just because of how difficult it is.
Yeah.
But
I've gone several events, and at the end of the day, you're just exhausted, and more so than with other decks, because Lantern playing it requires so many decisions in every single game, and if you misplay, you can often just lose due to that one misplay. So
you're also not getting breaks.
Hmm?
You're not getting breaks because you're going to time quite a bit.
Yeah, it depends on how quickly your opponent really plays. So on MTGO, I've never clocked out. Playing
but MTGO is different than an actual face-to-face.
Right. So the thing is, your opponent, generally, you have to keep them honest. And a competent Lantern player will play quickly enough where the clock doesn't really ever become an issue.
Speaking of the clock, we're coming up on a solid hour of Magic: The Gathering talk, and I'm sure we could continue this as long as we wanted. We could continue long into the night talking about Lantern Control. But we're gonna wrap this up here. That seems like a really good place to end, anyway. So, Nick, it was really good talking to you and having you on the show.
Nick, thanks for doing this.
Yeah, I had fun. This was great.
Yeah, and this it would actually be kind of ironic if our discussion on Lantern Control was the longest episode that we had. It would be fitting, almost, really.
Because next time somebody's playing against Lantern Control, pull up this podcast. And by the time this podcast is over, game 1 will be over for you.
So now we generally go over personal plugs, Twitter or anything. If you feel comfortable, wherever anyone could find you and ask you further questions on Lantern Control, if they felt so inclined. Do you have a Twitter or anything that you'd feel safe handing out?
I have 0 social media, actually.
Okay, well then
we actually found Nick in a cave.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we were spelunking in San Antonio, and there he was,
just playing solitaire with his Lantern Control deck.
I was born under a rock playing Lantern on Magic Online.
It was not unlike Gollum. He was looking at a playset of foil lanterns and going, "My precious." So,
yeah, that's exactly what happened.
So if you want to reach out and contact us on Twitter, we can forward messages on to Nick and we can get answers from him. Our show Twitter is at FishcastMTG. My personal Twitter account is at not Kody Smith, Kody with a K. It's definitely not me on that Twitter account. Matt, what's your Twitter account?
It is at Matthew Caudill 8.
And if you have a longer form question, you can feel free to email us at fishcastmtg@gmail.com. And then make sure to tune in next topic, where we will discuss. We've had kind of a hint of a lord coming up in the next block, and we also have these core sets coming out, which is pretty unique. The core sets coming back and Return to Dominaria. Our projections for what possibly could be coming up for Fish in Standard.
Cody's already hated mine.
I know that it's probably a 6-mana blue-green Fish Lord, and it's going to be terrible for modern.
Hey! You leave them wanting more, sir.
Yeah, you got
You'll have to wait till next week.
You got to keep those modern players coming. They're like, you got Silvergill Adept. What more do you want? All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. We'll see you next time.